listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, the place to learn about new technology and technological advances before they become mainstream. This podcast is sponsored by Ingram Micro's Imagine Next. It's not about the destination. It's about going someplace you never thought possible. Go to imaginenext.ingrammicro.com to find out more. Let's get into it.
Welcome to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. I'm your host, Keri Roberts, and my guests today are Tom Houpt, a regional channel account manager at VMware, and Tyler Zito, a channel solution engineer at VMware. Welcome, Tom and Tyler. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, Keri. Thanks for having us.
So, VMware believes we have to stop adding more and more complexity in an effort to solve cybersecurity challenges and instead use the infrastructure as part of the solution. In short, VMware says we must make security intrinsic. Would you say current security, meaning endpoint security, is broken and complex? And if yes, how so?
Yeah, great question. So the answer to that is yes. And it really comes down to what VMware has identified as the three major obstacles facing security today. So the first one is that teams are siloed. So when you look at the control point teams out there, we're talking endpoint, workload, cloud, network, and identity. They're really off just kind of working by themselves. On the surface, we'd like to get all of these teams working in unison, but in reality, they all have their own vendor. Each of those vendors has their own agent or agents, their own console or consoles, and their own set of data as well. So basically, these teams try to share their data back and forth. They try to get these different vendors and their respective consoles and agents linked up together. It's a very, very manual process. When they do find an integration or they do build out an integration, it's not all encompassing. It's very just sort of halfway there, not fully there. So they're not getting the full context that they need into what another team is seeing. They get used to their own vendor, they get used to their own console, they get used to the data sets there. And because it's so hard to work with those other teams, because it's such a manual process, they really just kind of stick to themselves, interacting with the other teams only on the most sort of extreme sort of scenarios. The tools that these different teams tend to use are very threat-centric. So what I mean by that is, if we take endpoint, for example, a lot of these tools are just hunting down specific pieces of malware or specific pieces of known bad, not taking the full context into their security approach, really just hunting down that one specific piece of known bad and hoping that that's going to prevent them from security attacks. This was fine, 20, 30 years ago when there was a pretty small amount of malware floating around out in the wild. But, with the sophisticated sorts of attacks that we're seeing today in the modern threat landscape, simply hunting for pieces of malware, it's just not going to cut it. So finally, we have teams using vendors that are bolted on the side, right? The infrastructure exists, and then they slap one of these security tools on the side and fingers crossed that it's going to work. They do stop attacks as they come in, not all, but they do stop some attacks. But really, it's just sort of a haphazard way to for your security posture there.
So what would you say the current threat landscape is looking like, especially today in the fall of 2020?
It's ever changing and it's getting more and more elaborate. If we look back, as I just mentioned, 20 or 30 years ago, there are just sort of some pieces of malware floating around out there, right? Security wasn't a huge deal 20, 30, 40 years ago, but it was sort of there. And those legacy players in the space that took an approach of AV scanning, and I'm sure that's something that everyone's familiar with, whether in the enterprise space or on their home computer running an AV scan, that was fine when there was a pretty small amount of malware out there. Nowadays, we have significantly more complex attacks. We have ransomware attacks, which is in the news every day. We have zero-day attacks, fileless attacks, living off the land attacks. So it's really getting quite complex. Every time an attacker gets stopped in an organization, they turn back to themselves, look at what they were building, change it, and then send it back out. And they can get it back out in a matter of minutes in most cases, just to launch a new attack. So it's ever changing. It's very dynamic. It's extremely complex, and it requires a set of tools that can really keep up with the the changing nature of the threat landscape.
Tyler, can you share with us, for those that don't know, what is intrinsic security and why is it a better option?
Absolutely. So with Carbon Black, we have a consolidated platform that's going to allow organizations to have more visibility into their environments and have more advanced protection on the endpoint. Carbon Black is able to further VMware's intrinsic security vision of securing any app on any device in any cloud. This is perfect for organizations looking to integrate security features into the fabric of their VMware infrastructure, as opposed to bolting on additional agents and further segmenting tools and teams. Now, this is something legacy endpoint security has struggled with in regards to staying ahead of the new age cyber attacks, which has frankly left companies at risk of breach with limited information, the inability to adapt to the quickly evolving security landscape that we see today. Now, as organizations make the move to remote workforce environments, VMware Carbon Black's cloud-based console helps organizations get centralized visibility across distributed endpoints, push security and prevention updates without corporate network connection, and remotely access and respond to these threats without taking any of the machines offline.
And you were just mentioning Carbon Black. VMware recently acquired Carbon Black. Can you tell us a little bit more about this acquisition and more about what Carbon Black brings to VMware?
Yeah, so the acquisition, which was formally completed, I believe, last October in 2019. So we had already been in works and integrated a little bit with VMware from application protection or app defense, as it was called then. So there was a lot of due process and decision making along the way. VMware bringing in a vendor that would be a best fit for them. So our vision's really aligned, wanting to protect the world against cyber attacks. That, we already had current integrations that worked with them very well. So, from a long due process, it just made sense from a vision perspective, roadmap wise, and how well we wrapped into that VMware fabric. And going back to what Tom said and addressing some of those issues where we see the current environment and the landscape being siloed, threat-centered, and bolted on. Well, we wanted to avoid, the overload of agents, right? We have IT teams that it's too heavy inducive when it comes to IT tools, such as antivirus vendors. So it's really low on the resource consumption side. Beyond that, it's going to be more consolidated. We want less agents, not more. So if you're already working with VMware, it makes sense to have the internal security that we're going to offer there, and that's what Carbon Black's going to be able to bring to that VMware fabric.
One of your clients, Indeed, for those that may or may not know, is the main company known for job postings and where people go to find new career opportunities. They deployed VMware Carbon Black Cloud, and they had a big problem seeing into the endpoint and knowing what was going on. So, of course, insight was quite important to them. Can you share with us a little bit more about how Indeed has been able to achieve a new level of security and peace of mind using the type of intrinsic security we're chatting about with VMware Carbon Black Cloud?
Absolutely. So when Indeed came to Carbon Black, like you said, they were having trouble seeing into what was happening in their environment. One of the true differentiators of Carbon Black is that we collect all of the data off of the endpoints. Now, no other vendor can make this claim. It's a true, competitive differentiator from Carbon Black. So by collecting all of that data off of an endpoint and being able to show it in our console, it gives them exactly what they were looking for. It gives Indeed exactly what they were looking for with being able to see everything that's happening in their environment. The other part as well is they're utilizing two of our different tools. So one of them is called Endpoint Standard, which is our next generation antivirus. That is a tool that has a whole lot of layers of prevention built into it. So we do have that standard scanning approach in there, but that's really just to, get rid of the low-hanging fruit or the commodity malware and take that off the plate. The next layer we have is artificial intelligence and machine learning, and this is where the tool starts to get proactive here. And this is monitoring for statistical variance of that commodity malware out there. And then finally, we have a technology in there called event stream processing. Now, event stream processing monitors the way that applications are interacting with one another and picking up on malicious behavior from here. So the example I always use for this is, an end user sits down, they open up Outlook, they click on their first email. Attached to that email is an Excel spreadsheet. So without really thinking twice, they click on that. And what they see in the foreground is, some spreadsheet with sort of benign data on it, nothing too important, and they don't really think about it. But what they don't see in the background is there was an embedded macro, which spawned an instance to PowerShell, and now the bad actor is off to the races, trying to encrypt files, trying to upgrade admin rights, trying to beacon out to a malicious IP address. So on the surface here, when we look at some of the legacy players in the space, if they were to look at this example, all they would see is Outlook, Excel, and PowerShell. From their point of view, there's 3 known, good, and trusted applications. But from Carbon Black's point of view, with that event stream processing technology, is that we're picking up on, again, the behaviors of those applications. So again, on the surface, it looks like 3 known, good, and trusted applications, but as the example showed, they're being used in a malicious way. So it's picking up on the behaviors, it's picking up on these tactics and techniques that attackers are using and being able to apply prevention there. And then they're also using a tool of ours called endpoint detection, and where it's really a tool built out for the end users who are getting proactive in their environment themselves. So they're doing threat hunting with this tool. They're setting up watch lists, enabling some of the watch lists that we have built into the tool, as well as building out their own custom watch list as well. So Endpoint Standard, the next generation antivirus, is proactively stopping threats. And then the other tool that they're utilizing, Endpoint Detection and Response, is giving them the capabilities to really get proactive in their threat hunting as well.
Tom, there is currently a free trial of Carbon Black being offered right now in the fall of 2020. Who can get access to this, and how and what can they test out?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is for VMware customers who have vSphere 6.5 or higher, VMware Tools 11.2 or higher, and vCenter 6.7 or higher. It is a free trial of the new workload solution that we recently offered at VMworld. And if you head to carbonblack.com, there will be a link on there, as well as additional information surrounding the free trial.
Now, one of the questions we ask on this show all the time is about where you see technology going within the next year. There's been so much change, obviously, in 2020. So whether it's in terms of security or technology as a whole, Tyler, I'll start with you. Where do you see it going within the next year?
One big thing I am very fascinated with is the electric vehicle industry. As we've seen, Tesla, 10 years ago, right? Kind of seemed as a joke. People didn't think it was going to be a feasible option as far as transportation. Now, myself out here in Denver, Colorado, they're left and right. I have 3 neighbors with Tesla sitting in the garage. More so moving into the trucking space as well. As recently as last week, Amazon put in a massive purchase order for the long-range commercial vehicle semi-electrical trucks from Tesla. So that's just something, in where I see it going, I think it's going to have a lot more of a footprint as we move in the next year, especially with that trucking industry. We're going to see a lot of the laws that are coming, getting written into, future dating, like 2035, right? California's promising to omit all gas vehicles by 2035. Colorado's doing the same thing, and the exact time frame I'm unsure of. But I think we're going to see a lot of drastic changes in the, beyond what we've already seen in the electric vehicle industry.
Tom, what are your thoughts on all of this?
So where I see technology continuing to grow is with our, virtual Siri assistants, whether it's Siri or Alexa or Google Home. I see these growing into different facets of our lives and different things becoming smart, right? So Alexa came out and Google Home came out. And then not long after that, they have the, Alexa for the car now. So I imagine it's just going to start bleeding into some crazy spaces that seem quite funky nowadays, but we'll have smart mirrors where Alexa pops up in the morning, and as we're shaving or putting our makeup in the morning, we have Alexa there with our weather, the top news story, reading off our flash briefing, and expanding into funky things like maybe even smart clothes or a smart belt. I know that sounds weird, but just being able to, instead of having to go on to Google and Google whatever your question is, just say something out loud. It reduces the friction of being able to ask that question or look up whatever you're looking up. And so I think it'll start bleeding into these different sorts of really sort of funky things that we would say now. It'd be funky to have a smart belt right? But I think in 5 years or so, it'll be pretty commonplace to have Alexa or Siri or Google or whatever the next virtual assistant is popping into as many things as we can turn into quote unquote smart as possible.
Yes, and both of the things you mentioned, all of that will need security as well. So I'm sure that will be growing too. If people want to learn more about anything we talked about today, or they want to ask questions, where is the best place to do that?
Sure. So they can just contact VMware_MD_team at ingrammicro.com.
And we will link that up in the show notes as well. Thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge today, and we look forward to hearing more in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keri.
If you like this episode or have a question, join the discussion on Twitter at Ingram TechSoul with the hashtag B2B Tech Talk. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro.
You've been listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, hosted by Keri Roberts. This episode was sponsored by Ingram Micro's Imagine Next. B2B Tech Talk is a joint production with Sweetfish Media and Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro production handled by Laura Burton and Christine Fan. To not miss an episode, subscribe today on your favorite podcast platform.